Howdy to Lexington Theological Seminary's Grading Bible Congregations webinar series. I am Wilson Dickinson. I am the director of the Doctor of Ministry and Continuing Education programs here at LTS, and I teach theology here. Before we get into today's webinar, which is Why I Care About Mass Incarceration, being led by Reverend Bucalos, I invite you all to join me for a brief moment of prayer. God of justice and mercy and healing and reconciliation and reparation, we ask that you still our hearts and open our minds so that as we take this time away from the busyness of our lives, that we may learn about the injustice and the damage that is being done to our world so that we may imagine and be activated to be agents of your love and your transformation and your kingdom. God, we pray that we may learn today and that we may be inspired to make changes in our own ministerial context and response. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right, well, again, welcome to the LTS webinar series. Before we get started, actually, I want to invite all of you out there to please message Dominique through Zoom and let her know if there is more than one person in your room, because I can already see on some of the cameras that some people are having viewing parties for this. So it's always helpful for us to know how many people are here virtually. Okay. So it looks like some people are doing that. Well, so again, I'm Wilson Dickinson, and I'm here to introduce our august and wise speaker today, Reverend Bucalos, who is a disciples pastor. He has pastored in congregations in Kentucky, Illinois, and Indiana. Prior to being a pastor, he practiced law for 15 years in Ashland and Lexington. He received his education from Vanderbilt. He went to University of Kentucky Law School, and he's also an alum of Lexington Theological Seminary. He is currently pastor at New Life in Christ Church, which is at a women's reentry facility. He's also program coordinator for Mission Behind Bars and Beyond, which trains faith-based groups to work with ex-offenders upon reentry. He also teaches at Bellarmine in Louisville. He's a volunteer facilitator for Juvenile Justice Pilot Program in Louisville. And he lives in Louisville with his wife, Andy Bucalos, and he has 2 adult children and 4 grandchildren. So please join me in your places, wherever you are, in welcoming Reverend Bucalos to lead us in this webinar on why care about mass incarceration.
Thank you, Wilson, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this webinar series. I'm grateful for that and an opportunity to talk about what I think is one of the more important and pressing issues that facing the church right now regarding mass incarceration and the dysfunction that has evolved over the last several decades. And so I'm grateful to have an opportunity to talk about it and share with you some of my experiences. As Wilson indicated, in the context for me to talk about this relatively enormous topic is my background, not only as an attorney that practiced law for a number of years, but also the work that I've been doing in places of incarceration over the last 10 years and working with people who have been imprisoned and are coming back out into the community. And so what I hope to do today is provide you with some background information about this important topic, but also to provide some information about ways in which our churches can become more involved in becoming part of the solution to what has become a national crisis in so many ways. So one of the things that we're going to talk about is really what is mass incarceration and how did it happen, and how did it all come about? Why are we in the situation that we're in? And the current state of the criminal justice system in the United States that has not only led to mass incarceration, but also has perpetuated it in many ways. And then the third thing I want to talk a little bit about is how our faith-based communities and people of faith can become involved in making some changes to the landscape of the criminal justice system across the country. And I'm convinced that our role as followers of Jesus are as important as any in making changes become realities with respect to a system that is really unraveled and gotten out of hand with respect to our criminal justice system. So I'm going to start with just some basics to talk about what mass incarceration is. It's a term that's been thrown around and utilized quite frequently over the last several years. And I think that's because we all realize that our prisons are woefully overcrowded right now. And it's expensive for us to keep people warehoused in these facilities. But mass incarceration refers to what has become the concentration of people who become imprisoned across the country, but particularly a disproportionate number of people of color who are now in places of incarceration. So what we do know is that there are about 32% of our country are comprised of people of color, and in our prison systems, there's about 56% of all those people incarcerated in the United States are people of color. So we can see the disproportionate numbers there just in that simple statistic. And what we know is that for African Americans, they're incarcerated 4 times more than the rate of Anglo Americans. So what I want to talk about as we go through this webinar is how that's happened and why those statistics seem so skewed, and is there some basis for that underlies that reality. So one of the things that I think is inherently important about this conversation is to understand statistically where we have come as a nation. And I think a lot of people have heard this statistic that our United States has 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prison population. And that's not talking about a per capita rate, it's actual numbers of people who are incarcerated. So when we think of some of those countries and regimes that are totalitarian and authoritarian and seem to be despotic and have no concept of civil rights, we have more people in prison than all of those countries. And I think that's a staggering and sobering statistic, that the United States would be a leading nation in the number of people that are presently incarcerated. And the places of incarceration in the United States vary in quality. So we're talking about places that are oftentimes inhabitable to places that are much more amenable to people who are convicted of felonies. So some of the statistics that I want to share with you is that nearly half of the prisoners who are locked up in state prisons today are locked up for nonviolent crimes. We think that most of the people that are in prison are there because they've committed some type of violent crime against their communities or individuals. But the reality is that because of the war on drugs, so many of the people that we have now who are incarcerated have been incarcerated for crimes that don't involve violence at all. One person said that, I like the way that he put this, that There are basically two types of people that are incarcerated in the United States. There are the people that we're afraid of, that are actually dangerous. It's a small percentage. And then there's the people that we're mad at, that we just think their behavior has been disruptive, and we just don't want them in our neighborhoods anymore. So we just put them away in faraway facilities. And that's really been the reality of the prison and justice system in the United States. As we look at where most prisons are located, they're in pretty remote areas. We really have taken an out of sight, out of mind mentality with respect to where we're placing people who are incarcerated. And if you have visited a prison or a corrections facility of late, you realize that so many of them are overcrowded, and that it seems as if we're just warehousing bodies. And it's something that's occurred dramatically and gradually over the last 15 or 20 years. So in 2007, the United States spent more than $44 billion on incarceration. That's a number I can't even wrap my head around. Related and that's for people who've been incarcerated for a variety of related offenses. And from there's been a 127% increase over a period of time up until 1987, where our spending has jumped 127% on corrections, whereas during that same period of time, our spending on higher education has risen only about 21%. So you can see that some of our priorities, as told by how we spend our dollars, has been disproportionately skewed toward incarceration and corrections, which in some ways is the word corrections is a bit of an oxymoron, I think. I'm not sure that much of what's going on in our prisons and jails these days is corrective behavior as much as it is retributive and punitive behavior. The United States prison population rose by 700% from 1970 to 2005. That's a rate that overpays the general population growth of 44%. And it's, as I'll talk about a little bit later, the crime rates have not risen dramatically during that period of time either. So it's not the result of increased crime and more danger on our streets that has increased the prison population. We'll talk a little bit about how that happened in just a minute. It's very difficult to talk about the topic of mass incarceration without visiting the issue of racism in America. They're two very closely related topics. And that relates back to our cultural shame of slavery that so dominated the early part of American history. So it's very difficult to talk about how our prisons became overcrowded and disproportionately filled with people of color without revisiting some of the issues of the growth of racism in the United States. So what we do know is that in 1863, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which basically said that all people held as slaves within the rebellious states are and henceforth shall be free, which was a watershed in the context of the Civil War that was taking place in our country, and a declaration that was welcomed by those who had been enslaved for so many years. But the reality of how that affected people's lives didn't take place until after the Civil War was over, during the period of Reconstruction. And it wasn't actually legislated until there was the enactment of the 13th Amendment. So the Emancipation Proclamation was a presidential proclamation that Abraham Lincoln made that sent the directive out to our country. But it wasn't actually codified until the 13th Amendment was passed. And this is an important component of the history of mass incarceration, because as the 13th Amendment reads, it states that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the parties shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So that exception that I have highlighted in yellow is really one of the more serious aspects of our constitutional proclamations, because what that basically allowed was forced labor for people who'd been convicted of crimes. And what that led to in so many of our southern states was the utilization of forced labor through imprisonment of freed slaves during that period of time of Reconstruction for a really insightful and informative exposition of that particular topic. I recommend the documentary 13th, which you can get on Netflix, directed by Ava DuVernay, and it's an explanation of the impact of the 13th Amendment on the whole circumstance of incarceration in America. And what occurred was that there was the subsequent imprisonment of so many people of color by the enactment of what was called the Black Codes, or now we think of them as the Jim Crow laws, which were enacted in so many of the southern states. And these were really directed to restrict the movement and activities of freed slaves, often resulting in their arrest, conviction, and imprisonment. And the reason for that was then they could be utilized as labor in the communities in which the prisons were located. And one of the ways that was done was by contracting with private companies to pay for this free labor, and the money would go into the state's coffers, while the companies would then utilize the imprisoned individuals for forced labor. And it was all done under the auspices of the 13th Amendment. So it was a rather insidious way of continuing the concept of forced labor and slavery that was sanctioned by state laws that allowed that through these Black Codes. So, for example, these Black Codes led to the segregation in schools and segregation in eating places, but it was also displayed in vagrancy laws, so that people of color would be arrested if they were assembling together in places where they had apparently not been allowed to assemble. Many of them were required to purchase contracts to work in areas other than farming. And so if they didn't purchase these contracts, which were often prohibitive in cost, they could be arrested and convicted and then sent to prison. And so what was beginning to happen was there was a burgeoning of the prison population that was being filled primarily by freed slaves, mostly in the South. So in South Carolina, there was a law prohibiting blacks from holding any occupation other than farmer or servant unless they paid an annual tax of between $10 and $100. And then we also saw some of the other remnants of this in voting laws that would require poll taxes, so that the limitation of where these freed slaves could go and what they could do was being restricted by laws that were being enacted by the states. And this was addressed to some extent by the two other amendments that came after the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. The 14th Amendment was one that guaranteed equal protection under the law as well as due process. And the 15th Amendment was the voting rights amendment that authorized that individuals that were emancipated could vote. But what we still saw were the local authorities enacting laws that restricted some of the activities and behaviors of freed slaves, so that they were still limited in what they could do. And so what we began to see is the proliferation of forced labor in so many areas in the South. And it was the beginning of what initially I named as mass incarceration, but I want to name it as discriminatory incarceration. Because what was happening is that select people, particularly freed slaves, were being discriminated against with respect to these black codes and Jim Crow laws, and consequently incarcerated. And the result of that was this free labor source that was being sold to corporations and companies in these communities. And so what was happening is that more blacks were being convicted of crimes because they became the source of labor. And there were a disproportionate number of African Americans then who were incarcerated. And what is interesting, I think, is that it led to the perception that since the prisons had so many black people, that black people must be more prone to criminality. And I think that that sentimentality has continued even to this day, where we think that because there's so many African Americans who are incarcerated, that they must have a greater propensity toward criminal behavior. And what statistics will show is that's absolutely unverified. So it's during this period of time that the Ku Klux Klan came into existence. They started in the 1860s, and part of their beliefs were some of the same beliefs that we're hearing today, kind of this nativism of the superiority of the white race, and so the Ku Klux Klan became the authority for white supremacy, and particularly in the South, and were also responsible for some of the higher incarceration rates of freed slaves. And because of some of the discrimination that was occurring, the stereotypes of African Americans became more embedded in American cultural life. And so in the early 20th century, actually, in the late 1900s, a statistician named Frederick Hoffman, who worked for the Prudential Life Insurance Company, he was really a statistician, kind of somebody that worked in actuary figures, put together numbers and did research, and wrote a long article called "Race Traits and Tendencies of the American Negro," that basically he was an apologist for the uninsurability of African Americans because of their some of their character traits. And he concluded that black people were inferior, that they were more violent, and they were prone to criminality. And so this was the journal that he published this, which was in the American Economic Association's publication, was designed to prove with statistic reliability that the American Negro was in fact uninsurable. And so these types of reports, which kept being circulated, they reinforced the stereotypes that were being circulated about African Americans and people of color and freed slaves during that period of time. And then the Ku Klux Klan was still very prevalent in their activities and in their discriminatory behavior as well. And so all of these things continued to infiltrate and infuse the American culture. And then in the early 1900s, the movie Birth of a Nation was issued, and this was a landmark movie by D.W. Griffith that was widely seen. It was a new industry, and it attracted numerous people to come and view this. And in it, there was the depiction of the Ku Klux Klan as these sort of white knights that were protecting American lifestyle. And the depiction of African Americans in this particular movie, most of whom were white actors who were covered with blackface, and showed them to be violent and dangerous. And so the stereotypes just kept increasing, and the roots of discrimination and racism got deeper and deeper in the United States. So I'm going to fast forward a little bit because the components of this just continue to embed itself in American life. The Ku Klux Klan had sort of this up and down popularity for periods of time, rising again in the 1950s, and then peaking in the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement, when they began to be much more active. But we still had lynchings in America in the mid part of the century. So it wasn't as if these activities had completely been suppressed. They were continuing in a lot of rural areas, and the prison populations kept growing, and they kept the black code and Jim Crow laws were still on the books, and African Americans were still being discriminated against and incarcerated. And so some of the prisons in the South became overpopulated with African American residents who were farmed out to help the labor markets in those particular areas. But as time went on, and the Civil Rights Movement began to lift up some of the problems in the enactment of these laws, and shifting some of the burdens away from African Americans, particularly with the Civil Rights Act in 1964, that changes began to be made in the lives of African Americans, particularly in the South, with respect to accessibility to services. But the 14th and 15th Amendments were revisited and were responsible for providing more due process and equal protection under the laws for people in the South, as well as across the country. But as we moved into the 1960s and 1970s, with with so much that was happening in the United States with the Vietnam War and with the rise of drug use, the backlash was then to begin getting tougher on crime, because we felt like some of our cities were out of control. So there were in the 1960s, with the assassinations of Malcolm X and Dr. Martin Luther King, and some of the activities that arose as a result of that in some of the urban areas, there was this growing fear of that our cities particularly were becoming more and more violent, and that drug use was becoming more and more rampant. And so certain things were beginning to happen culturally that changed how we looked at the criminal justice system, and ultimately radically affected how our prison populations were created. And so we entered into this politics of fear and anger. And this is when we began hearing the politicians talk about being tough on crime, and some of the policies that were beginning to be enacted in order to support this tough on crime mentality. And so it was the first time that mandatory minimum sentences came into the federal system, and it began taking some of the discretion away from judges with respect to sentencing priorities. The other aspect that occurred in state courts was the enactment of what were sometimes called 3 strikes and you're out laws, or persistent felony offenders laws, which would punish people for having prior felony convictions, which would enhance their penalties, which would give prosecutors more discretion to plea bargain longer sentences with people who had nonviolent, lower level drug offenses. The war on drugs was declared in the early 1990s because it felt like particularly in urban areas, that the crack cocaine and powder cocaine was proliferating and affecting our culture, and so there was this crackdown on drug dealers as well as drug users, with millions and millions of dollars going toward this war on drugs. And then what was also happening during this period of time was that there would be disproportionate and disparate penalties for even minor drug crimes. So what we do know is that the drug of choice often for certain criminals was crack cocaine, which was primarily more of a drug that was utilized by people of color, and powder cocaine was utilized by more Anglo folks and upper middle class individuals. And the penalties for basically the same amount of drugs was very disparate, that you would serve a greater sentence if you were convicted of the possession of crack cocaine, whereas if you were convicted of the possession of powder cocaine, then basically the same amount, your sentence would be much lower. So these laws were beginning to demonstrate some of the inherent racism that had infiltrated our judicial system. Other aspects that led to an explosion of our correction system had to do with the proliferation of sentences, life sentences without parole. More and more people were being sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, which meant that they were going to be serving out their sentences well into their aging years, which now we know has created an incredible expense in our correction system because of the need to provide medical care for so many aging criminals and people who've been incarcerated. The other thing that was occurring that led to more and more imprisonment and incarceration of individuals was the effect that the media had on all of this. So if you watch the local news, so much of it is focused on crime and crimes that have been committed that it almost has created a sense that we're inundated with violent behavior, and the photographs of some of the perpetrators of these alleged crimes are flashed on the screen, and often in very unflattering ways, and consequently, so many of the photographs are shown of people of color, and once again, this image of the dangerous black man has proliferated our media, and it has roots way back into the times of the birth of the nation and the stereotypes that were created back then. And then one of the other aspects that has led to the increased incarceration of people has been the rise of private prisons. And so in 1998, I think this is an interesting statistic. In 1998, there were 5 private prisons in the United States, and in 2008 there were 100 private prisons. So what happened was there was an increase of more than 500% in just 20 years, and the concept of private prisons is rather counterintuitive to the whole idea of rehabilitation and incarceration, because the motivation for private prison obviously is to fill the prisons and to make a profit. And to make a profit, you reduce some of the costs that you might have that would provide services to the people who you're providing services to. And so it also was a deterrent to reforming sentencing laws and emphasizing rehabilitation goals and reducing the prison population, because all of those things would affect the profit motive of private prisons. And we're still struggling with that today, where the cost of building a new prison is so great that private industry has come in and filled the gap in providing private prison population. So we now have something that is known as the prison industrial complex, where people are making millions of dollars in this social service to provide housing for people who are incarcerated. So all of these things that kind of came together in a perfect storm in the late 1980s and early 1990s, where we saw some of the effects of this, and prison population then began to increase. So these are numbers that I think are rather sobering, that there's a 500 to 600% increase in U.S. prison population in the last 35 years. Now, having said that, people will say, well, that's because the crime rate has risen, but statistically, that really hasn't been proven. The crime rate has really not increased dramatically over that period of time. So it's not like more people are committing crimes, and so we're putting more people in prison. It's who we're putting in prison and why that has increased the prison population. Some of that has to do with harsher punishments. Some of that has to do with this failed war on drugs, where so many people now who are incarcerated for nonviolent, low risk drug offenses. Many of the people who are in prison right now, particularly in Kentucky, I think I read a statistic that indicated about 25% of the prison population in Kentucky now is people who have committed technical violations of their probation and parole. So they haven't committed new crimes. They've just violated a provision of their parole, which could be anything from not reporting to their parole officer to not reporting a new address where they've moved. It can be a variety of different issues. Many times it's they've relapsed in their recovery and consequently are sent back into places of incarceration. And all of this has resulted in overcrowded prisons and jails. In Kentucky, for example, we have as many people in our county jails across the state as we have in our correction facilities. And those county facilities are really designed really as short-term holdovers for people who are waiting trial or who've been convicted of lower offenses. Most of those would be misdemeanors. And so we're now adding into that population lower Class C and Class D felony offenders. And consequently, the services that are provided for them are much more limited. So rehabilitation services providing a way to prepare them for reentry are not available. Even some recovery programs are not available to people who are coming back into these county jail facilities. And so you can see from this chart the increase in corrections. This is across the country. And much of it is due to the factors that I noted before that are across the board, where some of the laws have changed and the failed war on drugs has really resulted in so many more people who are being incarcerated for drug-related offenses. And we're not incarcerating the manufacturers of the drugs or the drug dealers as much as we are people who are using drugs and simply need rehabilitative services. And so I think it's been widely concluded that the war on drugs really has not been successful at all. And for 40 years, that war on drugs has been ongoing. There have been more than 45 million arrests and $1 trillion in government spending, which has resulted in our role now as the world's largest jailer. And what we now know is for all of that, drugs are cheaper, purer, and more available than ever. So we still have a drug epidemic now that we read about each and every day. So the war on drugs has really been dramatically ineffective. One of the things that occurred in the war on drugs is that there was a disproportionate number of people of color who were arrested for nonviolent drug offenses, primarily using drugs or possession of drugs. But statistically, what we know is that people of color don't use drugs more readily than the rest of the population. That hasn't borne out. So part of the reason why more and more people of color have been incarcerated is the way in which the war on drugs rewarded law enforcement programs to round up people and convict people for drug-related offenses. So there were monetary incentives for law enforcement agencies to have a number of arrests for drug-related offenses, and they would get more money and they could buy more equipment. And so, with that being the case, logically, the focus was on more densely populated areas to make arrests and to look for drug offenders, which often was in urban areas, which were often populated by more densely populated by people of color. And so the probability of more arrests in those areas was greater, even though we know now that the use of drugs was not any greater in those communities. So I'll let you take a look at these statistics for just a second while I grab a little water. Wilson, I don't know if people can ask questions, but I'm certainly open to that. And if they want to just do that through the chat mode,
They can chat, they can
or-
unmute themselves, and they can talk to you.
I'd be happy to answer any questions if people have those questions. It's a lot of information, I know, and it can be overwhelming, but it's important to get to know some of the basic statistics of how we got into this circumstance. So one of the things that we know is that 1 out of every 14 general fund dollars is spent on corrections. And that I thought this was an interesting statistic, that 1 of every 8 state employees works for a correction agency. So it's an industry for us now. And it's a driving force that it will be very difficult to dismantle. What we know is it's a costly endeavor. So it costs about $20,000 or so per year per person to be incarcerated in a state correction facility. That's in Kentucky, but that's probably consistent with most jurisdictions. And in Kentucky, we spend about $9,000 per student in public education. So we're spending $20,000 on the tail end of people who are incarcerated to keep them warehoused in a correction facility. And we're spending $9,000 in public education on the front end. And we wonder where we have a school to prison pipeline. Is the allocation of our resources is demonstrative of the results and outcomes that we're having. So this is a little bit hard to see, but it just shows where people are locked up in the United States. I know it's kind of a small chart, but the larger green area are people who are in state prisons. And in this particular pie chart, it's about 1.3 million people. In our local jails, it's about a little over 700,000 people. Our federal prisons, which we often hear about most, only have about 216,000 people. And then that's the brown triangle there. And then in the other ones, the light blue are the numbers of juveniles that are incarcerated. That's about 70,000. So you can see that in the United States we have, this is a significant part of our population, about 2.2 million people are incarcerated. And what I think is another interesting statistic is that 1 out of every 31 people I think in the United States is the statistic, is either in prison and jail or is under some type of supervision, probation or parole. So if you take a classroom of 30 people, 1 of those people is going to be under some type of supervision and corrections, either jail, prison, parole, or probation. I mentioned the resource, the documentary movie 13th, which talks about the ramifications of the 13th Amendment and how that led to discriminatory incarceration. But another good film that I recommend is by Eugene Jarecki called The House I Live In. It was filmed, I think, in 2012. And it was filmed in about 20 different states, and he interviews people who are drug dealers, who are judges, who are prosecutors, who are people who are incarcerated, and the impact on each of them with respect to this the drug war and the effects of the human rights violations that sort of arose out of this, and the implications of what this drug war had on American culture. The premise of his documentary is that he was raised, I think, in Massachusetts, and his family had a housekeeper, and the housekeeper had a son, and he and Eugene would play together when they were younger, and he lost track of the housekeeper's son as they got older, and so his life went one way, and obviously the housekeeper's son's life went another way, and he ended up tracking him down, and it turns out that he was involved in this war on drugs. It was a victim of it, and so part of Jarecki's journey is, how they both were little boys at the same time in the same place, and how one ended up in one place and one ended up in another, and how that came about. I think that was part of the motivation for him to produce this film. So I recommend that. These are resources that I think you can look at with folks in your congregations, and they would generate a lot of discussion with respect to these types of issues. I mentioned the differences in drug use and drug conviction, and this chart, I think, makes that a little bit clearer. The chart shows the different uses of drugs by either white people or black people. What I think is impactful is that basically there's not a significantly more evident use of drugs among the black population on any particular drug, and actually for every one of the drugs, the use among white people is more than it is with black people, but the convictions for the use of these drugs is so disparate that it tells us that there's some inherent internal racism that is involved in the incarceration of the African American community and people who are extracted from that community, and the effects that it has on those respective communities. What we do know is that when someone from the African American community, particularly a young person, is arrested for a drug-related offense, that they are quickly put into the criminal justice system. Oftentimes with Anglo students and younger people, their route is to look more toward counseling and intervention and the prevention of getting into the criminal justice system. So you could have two people who are the same age, who are convicted or who are arrested for the same drug offense, and one could get sentenced to juvenile detention, and the other, the charges are dismissed with that person just going to counseling, and the consequence is that one person, generally the Anglo person with no drug conviction, then is free to apply to college and jobs without any indication of a criminal record, whereas the other person is inhibited now by a track record that includes a criminal drug conviction. These are realities that we see all the time in our culture. Once again, demonstrating some of the disparities and the discriminatory nature of how we've gone about in enforcing some of the laws that have been on the books. So I mentioned that the Black Code after the Reconstruction period and the beginning of Jim Crow laws affected the African American population and increased the numbers of people who are in prison. What has been noted as the new Jim Crow approach to suppressing so many African American individuals and repressing and oppressing them has to do with this whole notion of mass incarceration. So as I mentioned, 1 out of every 31 Americans is in prison, jail, or under supervised release. And over 60% of those incarcerated in the United States are people of color. And that is radically more than the percentage of people of color, black and brown, in our country. Another sobering statistic that in 2015, that from men who are aged between 30 and 34, 1 in 17 were black, 1 in 42 were Hispanic, and 1 in 91 were white males. So you can begin seeing once again the disparity. And it's not because their crime rate has risen. It's not because the use of drugs is greater among people of color. 1 in 8 black men in their 20s are locked up on any given day. And 13% of black men are disenfranchised, so they're not voting. That's another reality that we see, is that it has disenfranchised a significant segment of the population in many states. There are thousands of people in the Commonwealth of Kentucky who can't vote because of a felony conviction. And many of those are people of color. So if we continue on the same rate of incarceration as we have since the 1970s, 1 in every 3 black American males who are born today can expect to be in prison sometime in his lifetime. I mean, that's a frightening statistic when you look at that. And with Latinos, it's 1 out of every 6. And what we also know is that the imprisonment of a significant adult in your life increases the probability of a child being convicted and imprisoned during his or her life. So statistics have indicated that it's 10 times more likely for a child who has a significant adult in their life who's been incarcerated to be incarcerated sometime during his or her life. So the cycle continues of mass incarceration by virtue of the number of people who are imprisoned. And then that doesn't include the effects of trauma on young children when somebody in their family has been arrested. And so there are studies now that begin demonstrating the effects of trauma on young people and how that leads to certain behavior as they're getting older. But the trauma can be of just seeing an adult in your family being arrested and handcuffed and put into a police car, or hit or beaten by a law enforcement officer, and the impact that has on your psyche. And we're beginning to see now that it's dramatic and evident, and that it creates circumstances that lead frequently to dysfunctional behavior later in that individual child's life. So this is another chart that illustrates some of the disparities. So the top line is this is the male lifetime likelihood of going to state or federal prison by race and ethnicity. And so the top line is for black males. The middle line is for Hispanic males. The dotted line is for all males, and the lower line, kind of the lighter blue line, is for white males. So when we talk about these issues, we're not fabricating the disparities. They're authenticated by statistics now. And another resource that I recommend, if you haven't read it already, is a book called The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, who is an attorney and is now, I think she's now on the faculty of The Ohio State University. but she's made a study of what she has demonstrated to be the effect of mass incarceration, particularly on communities of color. And much of the statistics that I've drawn from today for this webinar have come from Michelle Alexander's research, as well as the research of others, because it's, in her opinion, one of the more significant, if not the most significant, civil rights issues in America today, is the disproportionate effect of imprisonment on people of color. What has been demonstrated is the effect that it's had on communities of color by extracting a significant breadwinner out of that particular community and disrupting family life in such a dramatic way, and then recreating the problem by recycling some of the issues that have occurred throughout. Yeah, question.
No, she teaches at Union Theological Seminary.
I'm sorry?
Michelle Alexander now teaches at Union Theological
Oh,
Seminary.
does she? Yeah, that's good to know. It's a great book, and the other resource that I want to recommend is at the Samuel Proctor Project out of the University of Chicago, I think it is, has a study guide that's a faith-based study guide that is really a valuable resource that can be utilized by groups that read the book together and then get together and use this study guide. And you can get that from from the Samuel Proctor Project up in University of Chicago. And if you would like more information about that resource and others, you can contact me. My contact information is on the last slide of this PowerPoint. So this chart indicates that African Americans comprise 14% of drug users. However, 37% of those arrested for drug offenses. And that between 1980 and 2007, 25.4 million adults were arrested for drugs, and 1 of 3 were African Americans. So you can see how that would affect those African American communities so dramatically. I want to shift a little bit from all these statistics and talk a little bit about our faith. Yes, question.
I just wanted to get that last statistic before you shift. Thank you.
How am I doing? You still hanging with me? So the shift that I want to make, as I mentioned from the beginning, is how we as followers of Jesus can have an impact on changing some of this. It's good to know and helpful to know the problem, but I'm a real believer in reflection and praxis. And how do we put that into action? And what do we do? And how can we make a difference? And so I want to talk a little bit about that and how we can respond as people of faith. And some of that has to do with our sense of hospitality. And so I've selected a couple of scriptures for us to consider this afternoon. The first is from Romans 13, Paul's writing in verses 9 through 13, where, and I'm using the translation, Eugene Peterson's The Message. And he writes, love from the center of who you are. Don't fake it. Run for dear life from evil. Hold on for dear life to good. Be good friends who love deeply. Practice playing second fiddle. Don't burn out. Keep yourselves fueled and aflame. Be alert servants of the Master, cheerfully expectant. Don't quit in hard times. Pray all the harder. Help needy Christians. Be inventive in hospitality. One of the things that I want to suggest is that entering into this topic can be overwhelming when we just think that it's something that how do we ever change anything that has had roots that are so deep culturally and historically. But I think what Scripture reminds us is that things can always be undone, and that the work of the Spirit is really designed to help us undo those evil webs that have been woven in our culture and in our society. And one of the gifts that Jesus demonstrated was the gift of hospitality and welcome, by including everyone in his ministry and in the work that he did. And so hospitality to me is one of the driving teachings that I think leads us to a place where we can make a difference. And then from Hebrews 13, 1-3, stay on good terms with each other, held together by love. Be ready with a meal or a bed when it's needed. Why some have even extended hospitality to angels without ever knowing it. Regard prisoners as if you were in prison with them. Look on victims of abuse as if what happened to them had happened to you. I think one of the things that we often don't recognize, because we've, as a culture, have intentionally isolated people, is that the folks who are incarcerated are just as much a part of our community as anybody else, and they've made a mistake. And sometimes they've been made to pay dearly for that mistake. And unfortunately, because of their skin color frequently or where they live, that the punishment for the mistakes that they made have been harsher than for other people. And how we interact with those folks, not as pariahs, but as members of God's beloved kingdom, is a way that we can create spaces of hospitality and places of hospitality. And then, of course, the other scripture that is often related to this particular issue is from Matthew 25. And I know we're familiar with it, but I want to read it again because it still speaks to us. Then the king will say to those on his right, enter, you who are blessed by my Father. Take what's coming to you in this kingdom. It's been ready for you since the world's foundation, and here's why. I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was homeless and you gave me a room. I was shivering and you gave me clothes. I was sick and you stopped to visit. I was in prison and you came to me. Then those sheep are going to say, Master, what are you talking about? When did we ever see you hungry and feed you, thirsty and give you drink? And when did we ever see you sick or in prison and come to you? Then the king will say, I'm telling the solemn truth. Whenever you did one of these things to someone overlooked or ignored, that was me. You did it to me. And so when we think about those who are incarcerated, that's who we're talking about. We're talking about the Christ in each one of us, the one who visits us in places of prison as well as in our communities. And so we have a responsibility to visit and to treat those who are incarcerated as if they are Jesus himself. So this is a statistic that I think drives the response of so many of us. So it's a quiz question. So what percentage of those currently incarcerated will be released back into the community? Well, the answer to this is 95%. Some say now 97% of those who are currently incarcerated will be released at some point during their lifetime, right? Some of those will be under supervision, but many of them will not be. And I can assure you that many of those who are incarcerated now are not very well prepared for returning to our community. In fact, some of them are coming back more broken than when they left. So we take people who have been broken in some way and have some dysfunctionality, and we place them in an institution for a number of years. And it's often overcrowded and doesn't provide much in the way of rehabilitative services, because most of the resources are required to be allocated and dedicated to safety and security, as they should be. And then we expect these people to come back into the community with little or no resources and be successful citizens. It just doesn't make any sense. And the reality is that we know that being institutionalized has an effect on people's, on their brains and how they think and how they behave. And then think about how the world has changed in just 3 to 5 years, and what difference that would make to all of a sudden have left 5 years ago and come back into the world that exists now. So one story that I like to tell is about the man who was released from prison and was going home and stopped at a rest area on the interstate and went to wash his hands and couldn't figure out how to get the water on. There were no spigots. There was nothing to turn. He couldn't figure out how to wash his hands. He had to wait for somebody to come into the restroom to show him you just put your hands under the faucet and the water will come out. We hear from some of the folks that we work with that they go into a grocery store and they're overwhelmed by the choices that they have to make. So they've been told what to do and when to do it for so many years. They haven't had to make any choices with respect to certain things in life. And all of a sudden they're left with all these choices. It becomes overwhelming, and they actually have anxiety attacks as a result of this. So how do we help manage that coming back into the community? I think one of the ways that we can do that as the communities of faith is by creating a ministry of welcome and hospitality. So one of the things that we do in the program that I work with, Mission Behind Bars and Beyond, is actually to go behind bars and provide worship services and Bible studies and life skill classes for people who are incarcerated, and then and worship with them there and begin developing relationships with them. And then we train people to become mentors, to walk alongside them as they leave, to help navigate some of the difficult roadblocks that they face once they come back into the community. I'm convinced that one of the key ways of resolving some of the issues that have been created through mass incarceration is through the communities of faith becoming places of welcome and hospitality for people who are coming back into our society. If we can't do that as the church and be on the front line of welcome, then I don't see how that's going to happen anywhere else in our society. So there's some obligation and responsibility to be able to do that. We're called to do that. And as we know that God's kingdom is like a wedding banquet. And we're told to go to the busiest intersections in town and invite anyone that you find to the banquet. So it's our responsibility to find these folks and welcome them. They're not going to walk in through the doors of our church on a Sunday morning. We really need to go where they are, begin developing a relationship with them so they trust us and care and know that we care about them and welcome them back into the community. So I've used this metaphor of setting the welcome table as a way for our churches to begin understanding how we can become part of the solution with respect to this. To extend an invitation. So how do people know that they're welcome to come to churches? So many people who have been incarcerated have had negative experiences with faith communities, their own or others. Sometimes when they've they've been incarcerated and have come back to the community, and they try to go back to a church because they've returned to their faith, and while they've been incarcerated and they've been isolated or ostracized or alienated or shamed, and as a result haven't gone back. So it's important for us to meet them where they are, to actually go behind bars and visit them, and to begin that relationship, because it's all about developing relationships. It's not only applies to the people incarcerated, but if we expect people to come to our congregations and churches without knowing anybody, without knowing who we are, it's unrealistic. The way that the church grows and expands is through developing healthy, positive, strong, trusting relationships. And that just takes effort for us to do that, to go and meet people where they are and invite them in. And it's no different with people who are incarcerated. So we can't expect them to get there. We need to help them come to our congregations to worship, to provide ways in which they can access our church facilities and worship services, and help them do that and cross that bridge with them, and show them that they're welcome and wanted and loved. I mean, one of the great stories that Jesus told of the prodigal son is when the father saw him on the hillside, that he ran toward him, didn't wait for the son to come to him, but he went toward him and demonstrated that love and that care and that welcome. And I think that's an illustration that we can utilize when we deal with people who are coming back out of places of incarceration, who like that prodigal son, have done something that was in their own minds disgraceful, and are coming back with a sense of contrition and seeking forgiveness, and the movement of the Father to come to that person and greet them and welcome them and bring them in and have a feast is I think the metaphor that we should hold out for ourselves with respect to working with people who are coming back from places of incarceration. And so it makes a difference. And we've seen that in some of the folks that we've worked with. When they have somebody working with them, walking alongside them, and nurturing and supporting them, and holding them accountable as well, then their likelihood of assimilation is much greater. And so we set the table for people. We want to listen to what they need and educate the congregation so that the congregation is welcoming and understands the circumstances from which this person came from, and then equip volunteers. And we do trainings for mentors so that people can be equipped and prepared to work with people, because it's a unique population, and a lot of the people who are coming back from places of incarceration have what we know are co-occurring conditions. So they're not only coming back out of incarceration and having that stigma, but many of them have mental health issues. Many of them are in recovery, and all of these factors are factors that affect their behavior and their dispositions. And how do we interact with people who are in recovery, and how do we communicate with them, and what is our relationship with them as a result of opening up our faith communities to people who are returning from places of incarceration. So becoming equipped becomes an important part of being that welcoming community. And then the next aspect of this is, in setting the welcome table, is inviting people into this experience that we have come to know as worship, and to understand that people have different worship styles and backgrounds, and that the people may not know all the the rituals of a particular congregation. And it's helpful to be able to teach that and help people navigate some of those things and interpret the customs and the rules of the house so that they understand when to sit, when not to sit, where something is in a bulletin. Having somebody show you that, and so that you don't feel awkward or that you don't feel that you're out of place is a really valuable aspect of hospitality that we often don't extend to people because we assume people know what we know. And I think that this is not only for people who are coming from places of incarceration, for anybody who's visiting a congregation, so that every congregation is a little different and has different nuances and quirks that people may not pick up on. What we do know is that a lot of people who have been imprisoned and have been institutionalized are not, their social and emotional intelligence is not often at the highest peak. And so their intuition about what is appropriate or inappropriate behavior may not be something that we're familiar with or that comports to our standards. And so we need to be open and forgiving, but also look at these as teachable moments for us as we extend that sense of hospitality. And I guarantee you that that will extend to other visitors. You'll see that when they come into your congregation, that you're welcoming to everyone. And that when you say all are welcome, you mean all are welcome. And that you make efforts to welcome people and not expect them to fit in right away, but to help them to find their place in this rich culture that we know as the community of faith. So one of the ways in which our congregations can get involved is through actual engagement with people who are incarcerated. And I'm going to suggest that the best way to do that is to meet people where they are. So many of our congregations are already doing some ministries within congregations. One of the things that I do with the National Benevolent Association of the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, is to try to connect people who are doing prison and jail ministries so that they can begin sharing best practices and resources and support one another. A lot of times people are isolated and feel alienated in the work that they're doing, but the more I talk with people in our churches, the more I encounter people who have somebody in their family who's been involved in the criminal justice system in some way. With the statistics that I shared, it's not surprising that almost everybody knows somebody who's been involved in the criminal justice system because of this problem of mass incarceration. And so consequently, there's a sensitivity of that, but there's also this inherent shame that people don't want to talk about it. But by hiding it and suppressing it, we are eliminating the possibilities of bringing some of the issues out into the open and addressing them in ways that can be proactive as opposed to reactive. And so what we want to try to do by setting the welcome table is to celebrate when people return to our community or come to our community, much like the celebration that occurred in the story of the Prodigal Son, and understand that when one returns, we all celebrate because that is another evidence of God's grace and God's mercy and God's forgiveness. I want to also encourage other ways in which we can get involved in becoming part of the solution to this vast problem of mass incarceration. We have lots of statutes as well as policies that are in place that inhibit the reentry, the successful reentry of people coming back into our communities. And so some of you will remember filling out an employment application where there's the question that asks you whether you've ever been convicted of a felony. And we know that when you check that box, that generally that application gets placed in the circular file underneath the desk. And so people don't even have a chance to explain what that's about. There's a movement, and has been for a number of years, to ban the box and take that particular question off of an application because it becomes so discriminatory. And when I talk with the folks that we work with, and they ask me about what they should do when that box is on the application, I always tell them to be honest, but to ask that they can have an opportunity to explain the circumstances, because oftentimes the conviction that you may have been in prison for has nothing to do with the job skills, the job description that you're applying for, but it just becomes once again this this large category that allows people to discriminate. So there's a movement in a lot of communities to ban the box. In Louisville, for example, the local government requires any government contractors to not have this question on their job applications, and so there are ways of trying to enforce this across our communities so that barrier and obstacle is eliminated. The restoration of voting rights is another area. We hear a lot more about expungement and the work that's being done with respect to expungement, so that people can have their criminal records eliminated after a certain period of time after they've served their sentence, which then becomes important with respect to lots of other civil rights that they may have. But for people who are just right out of prison or jail, expungement isn't an alternative for them. But in many places, particularly in the Commonwealth of Kentucky and several other jurisdictions, if you have a felony conviction, you're not permitted to vote unless you have been given permission by the government to vote, and you have to actually apply to get your voting rights restored. There's a movement to try to enact legislation that automatically restores one's voting rights. It's really kind of an archaic remnant of some of these Jim Crow laws that disenfranchise people who have been convicted of felonies. And since we know that there's a disproportionate number of people of color, it's yet another way of restricting the rights of people of color to have access to voting booth. And so for a number of years, there have been bills that have been posed in Frankfurt to automatically restore voting rights. And we've gone back and forth with how that should be or could be enacted, but that has yet been the case in Kentucky. And so it's one of the few states that has not automatically restored voting rights to people who have been incarcerated. So they've paid their dues. They've done everything they need to do, and yet when they come out, they still can't vote. And so many people feel like that's an egregious civil rights violation. There's a movement to eliminate mandatory minimum sentencing, and what mandatory minimum sentencing does, particularly in the federal system, is that it requires judges to sentence at certain levels, no matter what other circumstances there might be, by virtue of eliminating some of the discretion that judges have with respect to sentencing laws. And so there's been a criminal justice reform movement to eliminate mandatory minimum sentencing, as well as some of the three strike rules that if you're convicted 3 times, then there's a minimum sentence applied to your sentence for that particular last conviction. What often has occurred in our system where there are these types of laws is that they become bargaining chips for prosecutors. And so people oftentimes will plead guilty to reduced offenses when they're told that if they go to trial that that these harsher sentences could be applied. So rather than face the possibility of a 15-year sentence, accepting a guilty plea and being sentenced to 3 years is often something that is preferred by individuals. And so we see this as one of the other ways in which the prison population has been increased. Decriminalizing drug possession, we're seeing more and more of that now because we realize that it hasn't really had an effect on the proliferation of drugs in our culture. It's just created a subculture of criminality. And so there's movement now to decriminalize the possession of certain drugs, particularly smaller amounts. Addressing police profiling, another aspect of discriminatory behavior has been the idea that police officers will have certain profiles of individuals, oftentimes people of color in particular neighborhoods, and they will move toward those individuals for arrests, and that has created once again a disproportionate number of people of color being arrested and convicted of lesser offenses. And then the last thing that's on this list, but that's not the only thing, is supporting the Bail Project, which is a movement once again that has occurred nationwide to change the structure of our bail bonding circumstance in the justice system in the United States. So many of the people that are arrested can't post bond because they're impoverished and don't have the funds to do that, and they haven't been convicted of a crime. They've just been arrested, but they can't pay the $500 bond to be released, and the ramifications of that are enormous. So if they're kept in jail, they oftentimes will lose their job, or they might lose their rental home. They can potentially lose their children, and so frequently they'll plead guilty to a lesser offense so that they can be released and return back to home. And we see this as another aspect of why our prison and jail system continues to overflow. The Bail Project is a project which is designed to provide bail for people who qualify, and then through services take action to get people back to court so that they appear for their court appearances, so that their bond and bail isn't revoked. And we're seeing fewer people who are pleading to lesser offenses and being released eventually on the charges for which they've been arrested, and much less disruption to lives of people who usually on the lower level of the income scale oftentimes inhabit our jails in our counties across the country. So there's a website that you can look up for the Bail Project if you want to support that. There's a fund that they put together to kind of a revolving fund to provide bail, and then to provide services to get people back to court so that the bail is then released, that people are released from places of incarceration. There are several solutions that the American Civil Liberties Union suggests, and I've alluded to some of those. One is the elimination of incarceration for certain types of offenses. What we know now is that the costs of incarcerating people versus the cost of providing mental health treatment is dramatically different. So it costs about $4,700 to house somebody a year in a treatment program for drug and alcohol addiction. And it costs, as I mentioned, between $20,000 and $25,000 a year for incarceration. Now, some of our places of incarceration will have substance abuse programs, but they're not as effective as those programs that are solely dedicated to providing drug and alcohol treatment programs, which are less expensive. So eliminating the incarceration for certain offenses, particularly drug offenses and other nonviolent offenses, is one of the recommendations. Strengthening the cost-effective alternatives to incarceration and drug treatment programs. Distinguishing, I mentioned this early on, between the people who currently are in prison who continue to pose threats and those who are ready to re-enter society. So, as I mentioned before, there are some people that we're afraid of that we probably need to keep incarcerated for their own safety and for the safety of our communities. And then there's the others who we're just mad at because they've disrupted our society by doing something that violates the law, and how we can adjust the ways in which we deal with individuals in each of those circumstances. One of the movements that I think is very helpful with respect to some of this is the restorative justice movement, which looks at the harm that's being done to the community and trying to repair that harm in ways that avoid people going through the criminal justice system and incarcerating them, but actually having people meet in communities, sometimes and oftentimes confront the victim of their crime, to address that, to seek forgiveness, and to resolve the harm that's been done in positive ways. So there are growing restorative justice movements across the country. I know there are some in Kentucky, in Lexington, and in Louisville, but it's another alternative to the approach of retributive justice and incarceration that we have now, which obviously isn't working very well. And then last, to regulate systemic evaluations of the criminal justice system on a regular basis, and to provide ways in which we can oversee what's going on, so we can be more proactive in making significant changes based on evidence-based practices that are more positive. So that's a lot of information. I provided some contact information if you'd like to learn more about the program that I work with, which is a reentry mentoring program called Mission Behind Bars and Beyond. The website is on this slide. You can contact me at my email address or my phone number, or at our email address as well. And then you can learn more about Prison and Jail Ministries at the National Benevolent Association of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ at www.nbacares.org. And they have a lot of resources there, some webinars, as well as other resources on this particular topic. So I'll take any questions if anybody's got any questions.
I was just going to also add, when you were talking about the justice system, I'm forgetting the term, but where the reforms are being done, working with those who have committed justice. I can add to that that little Clark County, just across the way here, is part of that too. My wife's part of the team that's been dealing with some solutions that way. We tend to think of that in urban settings, but it's also going on in Winchester.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Here's it. Yeah, there's none.
Oh, wait.
Is there a question? So I have a question. So are there a lot of ministries that are like your New Life in Christ church that you're a part of that also invite other churches to be a part of the worship service? Because it seems like that would be maybe a natural place for a church to begin to think about how to do this, is to, start a partnership in which, there's maybe some people who have been doing this ministry for a long time where they can learn from, and also maybe they can go into other people's spaces and be welcomed and really begin to think through what that looks like.
Well, our ministry is affiliated with a national group called Prison Congregations of America, which is an ecumenical nonprofit that actually plants congregations inside places of incarceration. And one of the ways that they do that is they actually work with denominations to sponsor a new church start. So that's really how we started. At New Life in Christ was a new church start at the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ in Kentucky. And now there are actually 4 disciple congregations across the country that are involved with prison congregations. And there are other denominations that also have become involved with Prison Congregations of America. But to answer your question, Wilson, yes, the most valuable way of proceeding is to try to develop a network of individuals who would be interested in coming into prison or jail or a detention center on a regular basis, and creating a worship space there that invites the residents in, and then from that developing a mentoring program. And what we've done is we will train groups to work with the mentoring program that we have, so that people don't have to recreate and reinvent the wheel. Yeah. So there are, many churches will have programs that go into places of incarceration to provide worship services. What we don't see too much of is that bridge when people and services are made available once people leave, and so we try to make that connection. And in fact, there are some prohibitions in some jails and prisons about volunteers who work on the inside being able to work with the same people on the outside. But some of that's changing, because we realize that mentoring programs are very effective, and the most effective mentoring programs are the ones that start when people are behind bars, and that relationship begins before they're released, and then people can walk alongside them, and they have that connecting point from the very time that they've been incarcerated to when they leave.
Dean, Tom Faulkner, do you hear me?
Yes.
My son has been in prison for 5 years, and of course, anything that I'm thinking about, you're already fully aware of, but I guess I don't know in terms of this group how many people have that experience, but I strongly agree with you that whether it's prison congregations or Kairos or anything to get people to relate to people in prison, to know the gang culture, to know the violence, to know my son has almost committed suicide. He's been beaten up by a gang. He's present in protective custody, fearful for his life. And I believe to really be effective in this kind of a ministry, it's critically important to know the reality of the violent environment that these people are living in, and the incredible stress that they're under every day, and the kinds of criminal activity, of course, that's going on, because, of course, the people who are supposedly running our prisons are definitely in the minority. It's the inmates who are controlling most of our prisons, and it's a tough place.
Yeah, thank you for those insights. I think one of the challenges is to be sensitive and aware of all of that. And people who are in corrections, those folks live pretty stressful lives themselves. And so I think it's important to be sensitive to all of those participants. But you're absolutely right that our prisons are dependent on maintaining control, because there are always more inmates than there are correction officers. And so the environment that's created is one that oftentimes is difficult to adjust to, because it changes so radically. But we work with our volunteers and try to inform them of some of the realities of places of incarceration. And then we also know that people who've been incarcerated, who have experienced some of the things that your son's experiences when they leave, are carrying those burdens with them as well, and need resources to help them work through some of the experiences that they've had while they've been incarcerated. Psychologists will tell you that the effects of institutionalization, no matter what it is, are dramatic and actually change brain behavior relations, that we think differently and act differently as a result of being institutionalized. And that transcends a variety of different types of institutionalization. So thank you for your insights, and blessings to your son.
Thank you, and thank you for your ministry.
What is your favorite story of a church getting involved? What to be bridges to folks coming back into communities? From your experience, what has been most successful?
Well, thanks for that question. We have a lot of success stories, and I think one of the most rewarding things that we've discovered is when one of the people that has been part of our mentoring program asked to be trained as a mentor and work with the people who've experienced the things that he or she's experienced in the past. And in many of our churches, we probably have had between 25 and 30 different churches that have visited our prison congregation, and they found those experiences to be incredibly uplifting. The facility where we have our congregation, and we'll have worship services tonight, visited by First Christian Church from Bardstown, and what they will discover once again is the hospitality of the women from the congregation. And so one of the images that come to mind is during a worship service in the summer. We worship in a cafeteria of a former elementary school that's now used as this detention facility in Louisville. It was in the summer, and we were in the cafeteria, and I was at the lectern leading the worship service, and I saw what it looked like, just sort of these flashes of red. I couldn't quite tell what it was, that were kind of appearing throughout the room, and And so we proceeded with our worship service. And when I sat down, I realized that the women who were in the congregation were bringing the guests glasses of water in red plastic glasses, and as part of their hospitality. So it's a ministry that really goes both ways. We have a group that is now that comes every week for 4 weeks to teach the women there knitting and crocheting. And then the women will knit and crochet scarves and hats and gloves, learn this avocation, which will be valuable to them. And then we have a blessing of those items, and we distribute those to the homeless shelter in Louisville. So there's lots of moments of grace that occur during the course of this ministry. Well, if there's no other questions, I want to thank everybody for your attention. I know that this was a lot of information to consume, and I hope that it was helpful to you all, and that you will prayerfully think about getting involved in this type of ministry at some point in your congregations. Please contact me, and if you have any questions, or if you think it would be helpful for me or someone from our ministry to come visit and talk a little bit more about what we do and how we do it, because we know that what we're doing is helpful and it works, but it's transformative not only to the individuals but to the congregations that have become involved. So thanks for being here today.